This country has seemingly lost the ability to have a respectful dialogue in regard to divisive, hot-button topics. One of the pillars of reasons to believe as a ministry is what is known as the Apologetics Creed. The Apologetics Creed states that we should always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that we have, but to do so with gentleness and respect. Another important pillar for the ministry is intellectual honesty. We believe that you should be intellectually honest whenever you're engaging with a different perspective or a different worldview. You should do your best not to misrepresent that worldview in an effort to try and make yours appear to be stronger. One of the things that they continually encourage us is that if you're going to engage with another worldview, you should attempt to know it as well enough to be able to defend it. And so I ask, what is more intellectually honest than inviting an atheist to come and present the thesis of his book, have an opportunity to hear a response from a Christian perspective, and then a chance to address that response, all unfiltered in his own voice. And so it is our greatest pleasure to have Steve Mendelsohn here from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. By day, he has his own law firm, which is an intellectual property law firm. By night, he's a deep-thinking atheist. And so he has written numerous articles that have been published in various skeptic publications. He's also the author of 2 books. One of those books is Shallow Draughts, Faith in the Absence of Free Will. Now, I think that Steve has done a really good job in this book of outlining the philosophical implications of atheism and acknowledging some of the rational difficulties. It's a book about belief formation and free will. Steve also writes with a very charming style. He has a very entertaining wit and sense of humor that you normally don't get to enjoy when reading philosophy. So I enjoyed that part of his book very much. And dare I say, this is the book that Sam Harris wishes he would have written. I can imagine that Steve developed a bruise on his forehead when he was reading his book and he was going, man, that's a great analogy. I wish I would have used that. Steve is right. I have been misrepresenting faith all these years. I highly recommend that you read Steve's book. We do have copies of his book. They're available over there at the book table. They're only $10 each. In this inflationary environment, that's a bargain. That's a steal. So, and I'm sure that Steve would probably be willing to make a personal note or autograph it if you would purchase a copy. As I noted before, my name is John Murphy. I currently serve as the president of this Austin chapter, and so I'm going to offer a response to his thesis from a Christian perspective. Now, the thesis I'm going to be addressing is his specific thesis. Now, atheism comes in various flavors, just like theism comes in various flavors, okay? So my response will be specifically tailored to what he's presenting in his book. I will also have notes of my presentation, so these are the notes that will be available over at the book table. As I always do, these notes will contain practically word for word what you're going to hear me present here. In addition, there's 50 or 60 pages of additional commentary in regard to the various topics and subjects that is brought up in his book that I don't have time to address in my presentation here. And another 15 or 17 pages of quotes from various atheists, theists, and scientists in regard to those topics. Now, I don't charge anything specifically for the notes. I would appreciate it if you'd be willing to make a donation of maybe $3, $4, $5 for a set of notes. I mean, there's almost 100 pages here. It can be a little costly, but again, if you don't have that money with you, if you don't want to pay that, I would much rather you take the notes and have them and enjoy them. I spent a lot of time and effort in putting them together than worry about any sort of compensation or reimbursement. So this is how things are going to unfold this morning. So Steve is going to have about 30 minutes to present the thesis of his presentation. I'm then going to take about 30 minutes to respond to that thesis. And then he's going to come back up and take about 10 minutes to address that response, and then I'll take about 10 minutes to dialogue with him further, and then we will move forward to the Q&A portion of this. So please join me in welcoming Steve to our Austin chapter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Good morning. My name is Steve Mendelsohn. If you see me shake up here, it's not just because I'm nervous. I have what is known as an essential tremor. It's the same thing Katharine Hepburn had. So if you see me shake up here, it's because I have an essential tremor and because I'm nervous. I'm told that my essential tremor is not life-threatening, and who knows, maybe someday it might just help me win an Academy Award. I'm here today with my wife Lynn and our son Jack. We came to Austin from Philadelphia this weekend at the invitation of John Murphy so that we can all have what John referred to as a respectful dialogue about some of the ideas in my book, Shallow Draughts, Faith in the Absence of Free Will. As suggested by the title, Shallow Draughts is about beliefs and free will. If we do not choose our beliefs, and if we act according to our beliefs, then doesn't that mean that we do not have free will? I wrote Shallow Draughts to explain that I do not choose my beliefs, and I do act according to my beliefs. Therefore, I do not have free will. Now, I know that this may sound a little crazy, but I'm hoping that throughout the next half hour, we can walk through these ideas together, and maybe you'll come to agree with me in some way. Like many of you, I suspect, I grew up believing that I was in control of my actions. Maybe not all of my actions, maybe not my reflexes, like when someone taps my knee in just the right place and my leg kicks forward. Maybe not other actions, like sneezing and coughing. But I believed that I was in control of lots of other actions, like whether to have Pop-Tarts or Cocoa Puffs for breakfast, like whether to walk to school or ride my bike. For these actions, I believed that I could exercise conscious control. I could choose whether to have Pop-Tarts or Cocoa Puffs, and I could choose whether to walk or ride my bike. Not only did I believe that I could choose my actions, but I also believed that I could choose my beliefs. That, like some of my actions, my beliefs were the result of me exercising conscious control. Later, I learned that this ability to choose my beliefs, and at least some of my actions, my ability to exercise conscious control over those actions and those beliefs, is called free will. Not only did I believe that I had free will to choose at least some of my actions, but I also believe that I had free will to choose my beliefs. Raise your hand if you have beliefs. Thank you. Now raise your hand if you choose your beliefs. Thank you. Before I go any further, I should define what I mean by belief. According to the Oxford Dictionary, a belief is the acceptance that a statement is true or that something exists. Belief and knowledge are not the same thing. It may be said that you believe everything that you know to be true, but you don't necessarily know with absolute certainty everything that you believe. We believe many things without knowing whether or not they are true. For example, I believe that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. That's Hamlet on the left. I do not know that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. I was not there to see Shakespeare write Hamlet. It is possible that someone else wrote Hamlet, but I do not believe that someone else wrote Hamlet. I believe that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. When I was an undergrad at the University of Michigan studying physics, my housemate Dan, who was a philosophy major, said that he could do better in an upper-level physics class than I could do in an upper-level philosophy class. I said, Dan, that's ridiculous. You can't even survive in an upper-level physics class without first taking lots of lower-level physics courses and lots of math classes. Philosophy is half BS. I've been BSing half my life. You're on. So Dan and I took 17th and 18th century epistemology and continental rationalism together. That's Dan over there on the right and me next to him. Not only was I the only student in that class who had not had Philosophy 101, I was the only student in that class who was not a philosophy major. We read Berkeley and Hume and Spinoza and Descartes and Leibniz and Hume and Kant. I didn't understand a word of Kant, but I managed to pick up a little from Berkeley and Hume. I wrote a paper for that course describing a hypothetical situation in which I look off into the distance on a foggy morning and I see an animal that appears to be a duck. As such, I believe that the animal is a duck. As I walk closer to the animal, and as the fog slowly lifts, the animal begins to look less like a duck and more like a dog. At some point, I no longer believe that the animal is a duck, and instead now believe the animal is a dog. I did not control the fact that the animal initially appeared to be a duck. That happened automatically and involuntarily. And I did not control the fact that I initially believed that the animal was a duck. That also happened automatically and involuntarily. Nor did I control the fact that the animal subsequently appeared to be a dog, and that I subsequently believed that the animal was a dog. Those also happened automatically and involuntarily. And the transition from believing that the animal was a duck to believing that the animal was a dog also happened automatically and involuntarily. Ever since taking that one philosophy class those many years ago, I've been thinking a lot about thoughts, especially the thoughts that we call beliefs. I do not exercise conscious control over my beliefs. Rather, my beliefs just happen automatically and involuntarily. We all have beliefs, and these beliefs are deeply important to who we are and how we behave. But how do we come to have our beliefs? I believe, for example, that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet because people I trust told me that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. It turns out that most of what I believe is based on what people whom I trust have told me, and very little of what I believe is based on my own direct observations. I believe that E equals MC squared. For all I know from my direct observations, E could equal MC cubed or MC to the 1.7. But I do not believe that E equals MC cubed, and I do not believe that E equals MC to the 1.7. I believe that E equals MC squared. And I believe that E equals MC squared because people whom I trust told me that E equals MC squared. Those things that I have heard from others about statements like E equals MC squared and Shakespeare wrote Hamlet are evidence in my possession. My brain automatically and involuntarily processes that evidence to generate my beliefs, like E equals MC squared and Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. But my brain is different from your brain, and your brain is different from everyone else's brain. Each of our brains is unique because no one else has both our same genetics and our same histories. And so my brain operates subjectively according to my genetics and according to my history to generate my beliefs. Your brain operates subjectively according to your genetics and your history to generate your beliefs, which may be different from my beliefs even when we both have the same evidence. My brain subjectively processes the evidence in my possession automatically and involuntarily to generate my beliefs. It's as if my brain has a scale with evidence for the truth of a particular statement on one side of the scale and evidence against the truth of that statement on the other side of the scale. If my evidence for the statement subjectively outweighs my evidence against that statement, then my brain will automatically and involuntarily generate my belief that the statement is true. But if my evidence against the statement subjectively outweighs my evidence for that statement, then my brain will automatically and involuntarily generate my belief that the statement is not true. Automatic, involuntary, subjective evidence weighing is the psychological process by which my brain generates all of my beliefs. both my so-called secular beliefs, like Shakespeare wrote Hamlet and E equals MC squared, but also my so-called religious beliefs. For example, I used to believe that God spoke to Moses from a burning bush. I believed that God spoke to Moses from a burning bush because people whom I trusted told me that God spoke to Moses from a burning bush, and my brain automatically and involuntarily and subjectively generated my belief that God spoke to Moses from a burning bush. Did I know that God spoke to Moses from a burning bush? No. But did I believe that God spoke to Moses from a burning bush? Yes. Over time, other people whom I trust told me other things that ultimately led me to my current belief that God did not speak to Moses from a burning bush. At some point in time, the evidence in my possession in support of the belief that God spoke to Moses from a burning bush was subjectively outweighed by the evidence in my possession that God did not speak to Moses from a burning bush, and my belief changed, automatically and involuntarily. Do I know today that God did not speak to Moses from a burning bush? No. But do I believe that God did not speak to Moses from a burning bush? Yes. I did not choose to change my belief about the burning bush. I did not consciously control the transition from believing that God did speak to Moses from a burning bush to believing that God did not speak to Moses from a burning bush. That transition happened when my brain performed the psychological process of automatic, involuntary, subjective evidence weighing on my updated set of evidence, and my belief about the burning bush changed automatically and involuntarily. My brain is a biological organ, just like my heart and my stomach and my pancreas are biological organs. My heart automatically operates automatically and involuntarily, according to the science of biology, to pump my blood. My stomach operates automatically and involuntarily, according to the science of biology, to digest my food. And my pancreas operates automatically and involuntarily, according to the science of biology, to do whatever it is that pancreases do. Oops, sorry. That's not my pancreas, that's my spleen. Here's my pancreas. My brain operates according to the science of biology, just like my heart and my stomach and my pancreas. And just like my heart and my stomach and my pancreas, my brain also operates automatically and involuntarily according to the science of biology. In particular, my brain automatically and involuntarily receives signals from my sensory organs. And my brain automatically and subjectively processes those signals to generate my beliefs. I do not choose for my brain to receive signals from my sensory organs, and I do not choose how my brain processes those signals. Therefore, I do not choose my beliefs. Let's do a little experiment. If you believe that you do choose your beliefs, and if you believe that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, then for the next few seconds, exercise your conscious control over your beliefs and choose to believe that Shakespeare did not write Hamlet. Go. How did you do? Did you succeed in believing that Shakespeare did not write Hamlet? I didn't. Let's try another experiment. If you believe that you choose your beliefs, and if you believe that God spoke to Moses from a burning bush, or if you believe that God did not speak to Moses from a burning bush, then for the next few seconds, exercise your conscious control over your beliefs and choose to believe the opposite about the burning bush. Go. How did you do? Did you succeed in changing your belief about the burning bush? I didn't. Over the years, it eventually dawned on me that if I do not choose my beliefs, and if I act according to my beliefs, then doesn't that mean that I don't have free will? In order for free will to exist, I must be able to exercise conscious control over at least some of my actions some of the time. Not necessarily all of my actions all of the time, but at least some of my actions some of the time. Free will is different from freedom. Freedom means that I am not controlled by external forces. Free will means that I can exercise conscious control over at least some of my actions. Since my brain is the organ that controls my actions, in order for free will to exist, my consciousness must be able to control at least affect some of the operations of my brain, at least some of the time. Some people believe that their consciousness, their soul, their spirit, exists independent of their body, and that their consciousness will continue to exist after their body dies. But I don't believe that my consciousness exists independent of my body. I believe that my consciousness, that is my awareness of self, my awareness that I exist, the I, and I think therefore I am, my consciousness is just another type of thought that is generated automatically and involuntarily by my brain, just like my beliefs are generated automatically and involuntarily by my brain. I believe that when I die, when my brain ceases to function, my consciousness will cease to exist. I'm not happy about that. I wish that my consciousness would continue to exist forever, but I don't believe that it will. My brain operates consciously, subconsciously, and unconsciously. When I'm asleep, I am not conscious, and my brain works unconsciously to automatically and involuntarily control my heart and my stomach and my pancreas. When I am awake and conscious, my brain works subconsciously to continue to automatically and involuntarily control my heart and my stomach and my pancreas. But when I am awake, my brain also works consciously. When I think things and when I do things that I am aware of, my brain is generating my awareness of those thoughts and actions. I have consciousness of those thoughts and actions. Free will requires conscious control. So when I am asleep and my brain is operating unconsciously to control my heart and my stomach and my pancreas, that is not an example of free will, because free will requires conscious control. And when I am awake and my brain is operating subconsciously to control my heart and my stomach and my pancreas, that is also not an example of free will, because again, free will requires conscious control. Only my conscious thoughts and actions could possibly be the result of free will. Is it possible that my brain operates most of the time without free will, yet somehow operates some of the time with free will? Sure. Is it likely? I don't think so. Sometimes I find my hand has moved to my head and begun to scratch an itch that I wasn't even aware that I had until after I have already begun to scratch that itch. After realizing that I have an itch and that I am already scratching that itch, I might continue to scratch. Now, free will could not have been involved when I first began to scratch that itch, because I was not yet aware that I was scratching that itch or even that I had an itch. Only after I am aware of the itch and aware of my hand moving could free will possibly be involved. Is it possible that my brain operates without free will at the beginning of my scratch and then switches to free will mode as soon as I am aware of what I am doing? Sure. Is it likely? I don't think so. What is more likely to me is that my brain operates according to the laws of biology without free will all of the time. Most of the time, my brain operates unconsciously or subconsciously to automatically and involuntarily generate my actions. The rest of the time, my brain continues to operate automatically and involuntarily to generate my actions and my thoughts, albeit with consciousness of those actions and thoughts. But even my consciousness is generated automatically and involuntarily by my brain. I do not choose to be conscious. I do not choose to be aware of my existence. That consciousness is also generated automatically and involuntarily by my brain, just like all of my thoughts. At most, my consciousness is a passive observer of my other thoughts and some of my actions. Or perhaps more accurately, my consciousness is passive observation of those thoughts and actions and not the cause of them. In order for free will to exist, my consciousness, that is, my non-physical thought that we call consciousness, would have to be able to affect my physical brain, would have to be able to alter the operations of the physical neurons in my brain. I know of no physics, no chemistry, no biology that would enable my non-physical thought, like consciousness, which is itself generated by my physical brain, to alter the operations of my physical brain. Rather, my physical brain operates according to the laws of science, automatically and involuntarily, to generate all of my thoughts, including my consciousness and my beliefs. So I do not choose my beliefs, and I do act according to my beliefs. Therefore, I do not have free will. Does it feel like I have free will? Does it feel like I control some of my actions? It does, but that is just an illusion. If I don't have free will, if I don't exercise conscious control over my actions, then should I be punished if I do something bad? If I don't control my actions, then wouldn't it be unfair to punish me for something that I could not control? Yes, it would be unfair. By the same token, wouldn't it be unfair to reward me for doing something good if I could not have done otherwise? Yes, that would also be unfair. But I believe that I should be punished if I do something bad, and I believe that I should be rewarded if I do something good. Not because I did something bad or good in the past, but rather to discourage me and others from doing bad things in the future, and to encourage me and others to do good things in the future. Retribution is not a valid reason to punish someone for their bad behavior. Deterrence is. As I mentioned before, my book is called Shallow Draughts: Faith in the Absence of Free Will. The title, Shallow Draughts, is from a poem by Alexander Pope. The subtitle, Faith in the Absence of Free Will, is from my son. It's a double entendre. You see, I have faith in the absence of free will, and in the absence of free will, I have faith. Thank you.
So when it comes to belief formation and free will, I think that Steve does a really good job of outlining the philosophical implications of atheism and acknowledging some of the rational consequences. If you are an atheist, then you must believe that you do not have the ability to think, act, or reason freely. Steve says it's impossible for an atheist to think otherwise, and I think what he means is just not rationally possible to believe otherwise. Recognizing the inability to think, act, or reason freely is what I have termed the atheist distressing dilemma. I mean, our mental freedom and free will appear to be so self-evidently obvious, and the rational implications of not having those are so detrimental, it is a challenge to many atheists to accept the rational consequences of their own perspective. However, to Steve's credit, he does acknowledge these difficulties and he swallows them, and he says that his fellow atheists should too. So what I'd like to do is begin by elaborating on some of these rational difficulties, consequences of the perspective. Now, if atheism is true, then I think that Steve does a really good job of detailing the automatic, involuntary, subjective nature of our beliefs and actions. And what separates Steve from other atheist writers is his recognition of the subjective nature of all of our thoughts and actions. Steve states explicitly what many other atheist writers only sheepishly allude to if they do, or they don't even point it out in the first place. So by saying that all of our thoughts, beliefs, and conclusions are subjective is to say that they may or may not be true. Now, why would they all be subjective? Well, Steve details. Based on the evidence in my possession, my brain automatically, involuntarily, and subjectively weighed that evidence, automatically and involuntarily assigning subjective probative values to each piece of evidence in my possession, based on my genetics and my history, and automatically, involuntarily, and subjectively generated the acceptance of the truth of the proposition. Other people who have different genetics and different histories, viewing the exact same evidence, could have come to a different belief. Their brains could have automatically, involuntarily, and subjectively applied different probative values to their sets of evidence, and automatically, involuntarily, and subjectively generated a different belief. So if this is how we think, then it undermines any confidence we can have to know whether anything we think or believe is true. Steve acknowledges this explicitly. I can't prove that everything in this book is true, but that's actually part of the point of this book. I don't really know anything for sure. Now, everything that I believe to be true, and that includes everything else in this book, is to a lesser or greater extent uncertain. That does not mean that I do not believe, just that I do not know. So Thomas Nagel is a very distinguished atheist philosopher, and he has written extensively in regard to the theories of the mind. I will quote him several times, but in this particular instance, he notes, our beliefs are always, ultimately, due to factors outside our control. It looks as though if any of our beliefs are true, it is pure biological luck rather than knowledge. Another detrimental consequence of the atheistic perspective is that it undermines any confidence we can have in our ability to reason. Steve seems to acknowledge this as well. The ASO process performed by my brain is neither rational nor irrational, any more than my lungs' oxygenation of blood or my intestines' digestion of food is rational or irrational. So Steve describes the physical, mechanistic process of belief formation. My neurons, as physical entities, must follow the laws of physics, because all physical entities must follow the laws of physics. Following the laws of physics means that my neurons are affected by physical forces like gravity and electromagnetism. As I understand it, my thoughts are not affected by physical forces like gravity and electromagnetism because my thoughts are not physical entities. They are non-physical entities. My non-physical thoughts cannot affect my physical brain. That would violate the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology. It may appear to me as if my thought 1 at time A is the cause of my thought 2 at time B. But that is just another manifestation of the illusion of free will. So this illustration is meant to give you a visual of this mechanistic process. And I did run this by Steve to make sure that it accurately conveyed what he was trying to describe. So to summarize, the bioelectrical chemical processes in our brain, operating according to the laws of physics, our genetics, and our personal history, produce each of our thoughts. But our thoughts don't have any causal influence on our brain or our other thoughts. The point is that one thought does not determine or lead to the next thought. Instead, thought 1 is determined by this law-governed bioelectrical chemical process, and then thought 2 is determined by the same thing, followed by thought 3, 4, and so on. So where do you find the laws of logic in the laws of physics? To reason is to form inferences, judgments, and conclusions in a logical manner. When you are reasoning, you're not merely just letting thoughts stream randomly through your mind. Reasoning happens when one thought implies the next thought, and then you end up with a train of thoughts that are connected contextually, logically, and rationally. There is such a thing as thinking well or thinking poorly, and the laws of logic are supposed to guide us in our thinking well and thinking rationally. So an argument is a series of thoughts that are lined up and contextually and rationally. For example, the cosmological argument states, anything that begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause. Now this is known as a deductive argument. In a deductive argument, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is necessarily true. The only way that the conclusion could be false is if one of the premises is false. The point is that valid and truthful premises or thoughts should lead to valid and sound conclusions or thoughts. But is there anything in the laws of physics which would determine that this law-governed bioelectrical chemical firing of a neuron or a brain fiber that produces one thought will then determine that each subsequent thought also proceeds contextually in a logical, rational manner? If Steve's thesis is correct, then any belief that is formed is held not because it makes sense, is true, because it flows logically and rationally from other held beliefs, but instead is held because of a law-governed physical state of your brain. Once again, Nagel confirms this is what it is to allow oneself to be guided by objective truth. It is a kind of freedom, the freedom that reflective consciousness gives us. Rational creatures can step back from these physical influences and try to make up our own minds. Now, Steve's thesis admits that we're unable to know if anything we think or believe is true, and if it undermines any confidence we can have in our ability to reason, then why would we have any confidence in the validity of the scientific enterprise? There are certain philosophical presuppositions that must be assumed in order for science to be considered a valid and effective enterprise. And one very important one is that our minds and senses are capable of accurately and truthfully observing and understanding the world around us. Now, this premise flows logically and rationally from the monotheistic belief that we are beings that were made in the image of God, that we have the ability to think, act, and reason freely, and that we exist in a universe that was designed by and created by God for a specific purpose. However, there is nothing in the atheistic perspective which would rationally lead to or validate that assumption. The agnostic astrophysicist Paul Davies confirms science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview. Atheism actually undermines the confidence that we should have in the validity of the scientific enterprise, because according to this thesis, whatever experiment you set up in an effort to learn an objective truth, well, you were determined to think that it might provide you with an objective truth. Whatever evidence you find particularly compelling, you were determined to find that evidence compelling. Whatever conclusions you reach, they are conclusions that you were biologically determined to reach by the law-governed physical state of your brain. Another scientist with a different genetic chemistry and different social background may very well be physically determined to reach a different conclusion. Now, Nagel is also insightful here, and in this quote, he uses the term evolutionary naturalism, which is just another term for Steve's ASO belief formation process. Nagel notes, evolutionary naturalism provides an account of our capacities that undermines their reliability, and in doing so, undermines itself. The evolutionary story leaves the authority of reason in a much weaker position. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. I think Steve would be the first one to point out, and rightfully so, just because you don't like the rational implications of a theory, that doesn't mean it's not true. As I've said, I think Steve does a really good job in his book of outlining the philosophical implications of atheism from this perspective, and also acknowledging some of those rational difficulties. But what does he provide as evidence on behalf of the belief? Why should we actually believe it? Well, he does provide two arguments, and the first of those is an argument that I'm calling his change your mind thought experiment. So he describes it this way. If the person was a theist who claimed to exercise conscious control over his or her beliefs and therefore chosen to believe that God does exist, then I would challenge that person, as a part of a scientific experiment, to exercise that control for the next 36 hours and believe that God does not exist. At the end of the 36 hours, the person can end the experiment and go back to believing that God does exist. I never had anyone take me up on that challenge. For some reason, scientific inquiry was not a sufficient enticement for those theists. Now, I have to admit, the first time that I read that in the book with Steve's sense of humor, I wasn't entirely sure he was being serious or if he was being a little facetious and just kind of saying that in jest. But he did mention it twice in his book, and he used it this morning in the presentation, so I do think it needs to be addressed. Now, the quote that Steve uses the most in his book is a quote by Richard Dawkins, which he uses 5 times when Dawkins says, "If something is true, no amount of wishful thinking can undo it." If a person has genuinely weighed the evidence and genuinely believes that something is true, it seems irrational to think that that person could then just simply wish away all of that foundational evidence and then pretend or genuinely believe that none of it, in fact, was true. Is it rational to think that you can change your mind and decide that 1 + 1 does not equal 2? Let me give you a counterexample. Imagine that you travel to a foreign country. It's a country you've never been to before, and upon arriving, you learn that there's this proposition that's being hotly debated. Well, they want a fresh perspective, so they come up to you and want to know what you think. Would you be for or against it? You've never been to this country. You've never heard of this proposition. You don't know the first thing about it, either pro or con. But you're generally a positive person, so you say, I'll be for it. And a scientist comes up to you and says, listen, I'm conducting an experiment on belief formation. I would like to know, can you change your mind for the next 36 hours? You love science. Opportunity to be a part of a scientific experiment? You bet. I'll be firmly against it for the next 36 hours. Now, is that compelling evidence for your mental freedom or free will? I don't think that Steve would recognize that. I think that he would, as he describes in his book, that your evidence changed automatically and involuntarily. What if a theist actually took Steve up on his challenge and agreed to become an atheist for the next 36 hours? Would Steve then recognize that at least one person in this universe has mental freedom and free will? I don't think Steve would believe him. I think that he would again chalk it up to his thesis. My question is, what good is a thought experiment if you're not willing to believe the results of the thought experiment? We do change our minds numerous times over our lives. And as Steve does a good job detailing in his book, we do change our minds based on the weighing of various lines of evidence over time. The question is whether at any point over that time we were ever able to weigh any of that evidence freely, or if each and every instance our conclusions were biologically determined for us. And I don't think that that thought experiment really addresses that particular question. Now, he does offer another argument that many skeptics find very compelling, and it's a problem known as the problem of interactionism. He describes it this way: free will requires that my non-physical consciousness can control or at least affect my physical brain. I'm not aware of any principle of physics that would support such a notion. Rather, the ability of my non-physical consciousness just to affect the bioelectrical chemical processes of my physical brain violates just about everything that I know about physics. So how can something non-physical like a thought or your consciousness, which has no material existence, meaning it has no mass, it has no spatial location, it has no physical force or inertia, how can something like that cause something physical to happen? How and where would the non-physical and the physical connect or interact? Well, as I noted, the problem of interactionism has been very compelling for many skeptics. However, it is not evidence against our mental freedom and free will. Instead, it is just acknowledging that the whole concept of mental freedom conflicts with the physical, mechanistic, law-governed worldview. I think Steve would agree that if free will and mental freedom actually exist, then they would be a supernatural phenomenon, meaning they would exist outside of or independent of the laws of physics. Mental freedom means that the laws of physics don't determine everything that you think or do. The Center for Naturalism confirms what's special about this naturalistic view is that we don't have free will. Now, many people think they do have this power, but to think that would be to hold a supernatural view of ourselves, the opposite of naturalism. So again, if we both agree that mental freedom and free will requires a supernatural explanation, then by definition, that would mean that there's not going to be a physical, mechanistic explanation for it. Simply pointing out that there is no principle of physics which would support such a notion is just merely agreeing with the definition of mental freedom, and I would argue it's not evidence against it. The problem is created by demanding a natural, materialistic explanation for a supernatural, immaterial phenomenon, which seems incoherent. Now, this doesn't solve the mystery of agency, but it does imply that the solution won't be limited to a strictly physical one. And once again, Nagel is insightful, noting, the reasons against a purely physical theory of consciousness are strong enough to make it seem likely that there may be more to the world than can be understood by physical science. Now again, I think Steve has done a great job in his book of outlining the philosophical implications of atheism and acknowledging some of those rational difficulties. For me, the evidence hasn't been compelling for why we should believe it. And so with my remaining time, what I would like to do is look at what I think is compelling evidence on behalf of our mental freedom and free will. So the first question I think we have to address is it ever rational to appeal to a supernatural explanation for any given phenomenon? Well, the Big Bang is the term describing the beginning of the universe when all space, time, matter, and energy began to exist at a moment called the singularity. The Big Bang theory is the cornerstone of modern cosmology, and it was a product of Einstein's general theory of relativity, one of the most widely tested and confirmed theories in all of science. Now, earlier we noted that the cosmological argument states that if the universe began to exist, then it must have a cause. That cause must exist outside of the universe. Therefore, the Big Bang would be a supernatural event, meaning that it requires an explanation or a cause that exists outside of, over and above, or beyond the laws of physics. Alan Sandage was a student of Edwin Hubble, and many consider him to be the father of modern-day astronomy. And at an Origins conference in 1985, he would state this in regard to the Big Bang: "Here is evidence for what can only be described as a supernatural event." The agnostic astronomer Robert Jastrow confirms, "The faith of the scientist is violated by the discovery that the world had a beginning under conditions in which the known laws of physics are not valid and is a product of forces or circumstances we cannot discover. A sound explanation may exist for the explosive birth of our universe, but if it does, science cannot find out what that explanation is." Science is incapable of discovering the explanation or the cause because the known laws of physics also came into existence at that same moment of creation. In the same way that you can't appeal to yourself to explain your own birth or your own beginning, you can't appeal to the laws of physics to explain their beginning. Laws of physics can't tell you what happened before they began to exist. Big Bang cosmology gives us a credible reason to believe that supernatural explanations may be required for at least some phenomenon. Now, perhaps the strongest evidence is that our mental freedom and free will is one of the most self-evidently obvious aspects of our existence which we can experience and observe. Recognizing our mental freedom and free will allows us to live our lives exactly as we experience them. The rationally consistent skeptic is required to disbelieve that. They're required to think that no, it's just an illusion. Nothing you think or do is quite as it seems. Now, in his book, Steve notes that we receive evidence via testimonial and direct evidence. So testimonial evidence is what other people tell us, and direct evidence is what we experience ourselves. So the irony is that Steve has placed more faith, or in his words, he has put more probative value on the testimonial evidence of what other atheists have told him that he should think versus the mental freedom and the free will that he directly experiences himself. Again, all atheists recognize that we appear to have mental freedom and free will, but they have to downplay that and say that it's just an illusion. Our ability to reason and follow the laws of logic, I think, is good evidence on behalf of our mental freedom. Coherence is not a physical property. Think about that. Coherence is not a physical property. Rationality implies that something other than strictly physical mechanisms are connecting our thoughts contextually, logically, and rationally. The tremendous success of science, I believe, is evidence on behalf of our mental freedom. Science is the systematic, objective knowledge of the physical or natural world that is gained through observation and experimentation. Recall that if Steve's thesis is correct, then all of our thoughts and beliefs are merely subjective. Obtaining objective knowledge requires a certain amount of mental freedom. Philosopher of the mind Jagan Kim confirms, experimentation differs from passive observation in that it requires our interactive intervention in the natural course of events. We carefully design and deliberately set up the experimental conditions, and then we observe the outcome. This means that experimentation presupposes mental to physical causation and is impossible without it. Mental to physical causation is just another way of saying that our thoughts and our consciousness do have causal influence, causal power. Now, in his book, Steve quotes the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who describes two modes of thinking. Kahneman notes, "I will refer to two systems of mind, System 1 and System 2. System 1 operates automatically and quickly with little or no effort and no sense of voluntary control. System 2 allocates attention to the effortful mental activities that demand it, including complex calculations. The operations of System 2 are often associated with a subjective experience of agency, choice, and concentration. Now, System 1 continuously generates suggestions for System 2. These are impressions, intuitions, intentions, and feelings. If endorsed by System 2, then impressions and intuitions turn into beliefs, and impulses turn into voluntary actions." Now, despite the appearance of agency, choice, and voluntary actions in System 2, Steve believes that both systems operate the same. They both operate automatically, involuntarily, and subjectively. Now, I agree that System 1 style thinking does operate automatically, involuntarily, and subjectively. When I daydream, there are a stream of thoughts that run through my consciousness that I don't originate, nor do I control. And I do experience the System 1 thoughts that will occasionally just pop into my mind, just out of nowhere, and again, beyond my control. However, I can introspectively distinguish the difference between a passive System 1 thought that just pops into my mind and the intentional 2 style of thinking upon which I actively entertain, reflect, and control. When a System 1 thought pops into my mind, I can choose whether to consider it further, to reject it, to go back to what I was thinking about previously, or move on to some other subject entirely different. A System 1 thought pops into my mind, I can choose to consider it further, or sometimes I can actually rise above and choose to think or do something else instead. Now, although Steve doesn't agree, he does acknowledge that this System 2 style of thinking could potentially be evidence on behalf of our free will. He notes, "There are times when I think of something to say before I say it, and then decide not to say it, or decide to modify what I was planning on saying. Those instances could possibly be the result of me exercising free will." Now, as noted previously, Steve's thesis says that all of our thoughts and actions arise due to natural processes, and that one thought does not determine or influence the next thought. Now, this is known as a bottom-up approach to belief formation and free will because all of our thoughts and actions arise due to natural mechanisms. Conversely, libertarian freedom suggests that an agent has at least some mental freedom and the ability to control our thoughts, and that our thoughts do have causal influence on other thoughts and action. This is known as a top-down approach to belief formation and action because some of our thoughts and actions are causally handed down via an agent acting of his or her own free will. Now, Dr. Michael Gazzaniga is a neuroscientist who has written extensively in regard to the science of the mind. And in his book titled "Who's in Charge?", he refers to research which appears to confirm this top-down style of self-control. He notes, "I will argue that modern neuroscience is not, in fact, establishing what amounts to a wholesale fundamentalism with respect to determinism. I will maintain that the mind, which is somehow generated by the physical processes of the brain, constrains the brain. Mental states that emerge from our neural actions do constrain the very brain activity that gave rise to them. Mental states such as beliefs, thoughts, and desires all arise from brain activity and in turn can and do influence our decisions to act one way or another. The bottom-up pull sometimes loses out to a top-down belief in the battle to initiate an action." Marcel Brass and Patrick Haggard have begun to study one aspect of intention that has been oddly neglected, whether to implement the intention, the brakes that can be consciously thrown on that unconscious bubbling up. Their data suggest a trait-like predisposition for self-control. They suggest that this is an example of top-down processing where one mental state influences the next and argues against hard determinism. Brakes can be put on unconscious intentions. So why should anyone believe the atheistic thesis other than these are just the philosophical consequences of that worldview? Why should we believe that the mental freedom and the free will that we all experience isn't real, that it really is just an illusion? Outside of the philosophical belief that this is what you should think, this is what you have to think, I haven't really found a lot of compelling evidence to make me disbelieve my experience of mental freedom and free will. And Steve even confirms, it's certainly possible that my atheism was a contributing factor to, and maybe even the dominant reason for, my subsequent free willism, meaning his disbelief in mental freedom and free will. And I really think it's to Steve's credit that he's willing to be humble enough and intellectually honest enough to admit that in his writing. Atheism attempts to sweep the evidence of our mental freedom and free will behind the veil of a philosophical worldview, but I think that the evidence on behalf of our mental freedom and free will give us very good reason to question the validity of atheism as a worldview. Now that is my presentation. I'm going to confess, thank you, I'm going to confess this is the part of this program that I've been looking forward to the most, because I've read Steve's book 3 times already. I had a good feel for what he was going to present. I've been going over my presentation to the point that I'm sick of it at this point. I want to hear, one of the things I want to hear is I want to make sure that I represented Steve accurately, so I'm hoping that he may correct any misunderstanding, and I'll look forward to hearing that. And then also hear his response. So would you set your timer to 10 minutes? And then Steve is going to take 10 minutes to address this, and when you get to 9 minutes, if you will just tell him a 1-minute warning. Okay?
Thank you, John. I'd say you characterized my thoughts and ideas accurately. I might have to go back and edit some of Shallow Draughts to point out a point or two, but and John was gracious enough to give me a copy of Nagel's book that he's quoted from so often, and I'm glad I didn't read Nagel's book before, because then I might not have written Shallow Draughts, because he seems to say a lot of what I was saying also. So my goal has never been to prove that my atheism is correct. Rather, my goal has been to challenge the premise that we choose our beliefs. That's what got me started on writing Shallow Draughts 40 years ago when I started thinking about these things. It was only more recently that I came to realize that if we don't choose our beliefs, and if we act according to our beliefs, then doesn't that mean we don't have free will? And I said, no, we can't go there. Society would fall apart. That would be terrible. And then I read Sam Harris's book, Free Will, and he said, not only do we not control our thoughts, but we don't control our actions. We don't have free will. And I said, son of a bitch, he wrote my book. And then some. And then I was listening to Seawolf by Jack London. And in Seawolf, the captain goes off on this tirade about how we don't control our thoughts and we don't control our actions. And I thought, well, if Sam Harris can write Free Will after Jack London had already written the same thoughts 100 years earlier, I can write Shallow Draughts. But I have to say, as a footnote, I didn't choose to write Shallow Draughts. I don't believe that free will is impossible. I just don't believe that it exists. If you are a theist, it's easy to believe that free will exists. It's a miracle. As John said, it's a supernatural event. The lack of conscious control over my beliefs implies the non-existence of free will, as I explained. It's virtually impossible to explain the existence of free will. John talks a lot about reasoning and logic, but reasoning and logic are just thoughts, like beliefs and consciousness are thoughts. So to say that logic exists and reasoning exists is not an argument that we don't have free will. Those are just other thoughts that are generated automatically and voluntarily by my brain. I believe that, hadn't thought of this before now, but that logic and reasoning, maybe as Nagel suggests, are the result of evolution, right? Logic and reasoning are based on consistency. If people acted illogically, what eventually came to be known as illogic, well, they'd fall off a cliff, or they'd get hit by a dinosaur, or whatever. They wouldn't have survived. So, to me, evolution has produced the brain that I have, the brain that we all have, the brains that we all have, that function logically and according to reason. That's not a proof that we don't have, that our thoughts aren't generated automatically and involuntarily. So just another footnote. So the opposite of free will is not necessarily determinism. Determinism says, everything is preordained, everything is predetermined by the physics of the universe. Well, complete randomness is also an example of the absence of free will. If everything happened just randomly, that would also be not free will. But I don't believe that I don't believe in pure determinism. Certainly don't believe in pure randomness. I personally believe that most of our existence is substantially predetermined with a little quantum mechanical uncertainty thrown in there. That's really what I had to say in rebuttal, or commenting on the comments that you made. When you have, I guess, just to clarify one thing, in terms of Daniel Kahneman's System 1 thoughts and System 2 thoughts, and John says, he has System 1 thoughts, they come automatically, and then he can consider them. He can realize that he's had those System 1 thoughts, and he can think other thoughts. Well, the realization of those System 1 thoughts and the reconsideration of those System 1 thoughts as System 2 thoughts also happens automatically and involuntarily as a result of processes in my brain. Thank you.
So Steve said that he had never done this before. He had never made a presentation to a crowd like this before. And so obviously he was a little bit nervous. I don't know if I was trying to make notes over there, and my hand was shaking so much that it's almost illegible. So I'm shaking just because I'm nervous, not because I've been diagnosed with anything. But I think y'all would probably agree with me that Steve has done a really excellent job of making his presentation. And I'll also say that over the last few months of us dialoguing and emailing back and forth and getting to know each other, I've really grown to like Steve a lot. And I hope that our relationship continues past this. He's even expressed the same thing. And so I'm proud of you. I think you've done a really good job explaining your position, and I've enjoyed it, and I do think you did a really good job. And so one of my fears was that you would be so likable that, because my presentations tend to be much more serious, that people would think, boy, I sure do like that guy. Some of those beliefs are crazy, but I might have to believe one or two just to make him feel good. I want to send him home a winner. So one of the main themes in your book is that no matter whether it's System 1 or System 2, whether it's slow or fast, that all of the thinking is the same. It's automatic, involuntary, and subjective. And so one of the things that you brought up in your presentation that I don't recall you addressing as much in the book was the differences between unconscious, subconscious, and conscious. And so I think that also shows the difference in our thinking styles, because when we are unconscious, when we're asleep, think about what you're doing. You're dreaming. Think about the content of your dreams and how they flow. One of the things about dreaming is that is a disconnected reality, right? When you're dreaming, there are a lot of things about dreams don't make any sense. They tend to be bizarre. My wife woke up this morning and mentioned that she was having these bizarre dreams last night, kept waking her up. She's having a hard time sleeping. Because in the dream world, you don't answer questions like, how did I get here? Okay, there's not this continuity that happens in the dream world. And so what your brain is doing when you're dreaming appears to be different, because think about your subconscious, not when you're conscious, but your subconscious. Now, Steve points out that when you're unconscious and when you're subconscious, that your organs are still acting the same way. And that's correct in regard to our organs. But when it comes to our brain, our level of thinking and how we think about when we're awake but subconscious as opposed to unconscious is different. When I daydream, it is a different style of reality than when I'm dreaming. It is more connected to reality. Now, I'm not controlling all of my thoughts, but somehow or another, the fact that I'm awake, the fact that there is a causal conscious influence keeps my daydreams more connected to reality. Some of them may border on fantasy, okay, or horror, depending upon what I happen to be dreaming about, but they're still much more connected to reality than are the process when I'm dreaming. And then, of course, when I'm conscious, I do recognize a difference in my thoughts and my behavior and the way that my brain acts. So again, I do think that that is evidence that our brain does operate in different levels depending upon your consciousness, and that your consciousness does have some causal influence there. Reason and logic. One of the things that differentiates Steve from a lot of other atheist thinkers is that Steve will recognize the immaterial nature of our thoughts and our consciousness and our feelings, our hopes, our desires. Most atheists are materialists, and they believe that there's nothing that's immaterial. That if you have thoughts, if you have consciousness, if you have hopes, if you have dreams, that those are just material, physical mechanisms, okay? And that we think that they're immaterial, but they're not. They're just material. And so, again, what separates Steve is that he does acknowledge that the material produces this immaterial thoughts and consciousness. The question, the problem that Nagel really does a good job elaborating and pointing out is that how do those physical mechanisms connect thoughts contextually, logically, and rationally? It's one thing to have a mechanistic physical process to produce a thought, but how do those thoughts get connected logically and rationally strictly from a physical mechanism? And that is probably one of the biggest challenges, I think, that many atheists face in trying to explain that. Sam Harris acknowledges a lot of the disconnect in rationality in a couple of his books, in Free Will and The Moral Landscape, I think was his other book. But then he will go on and reason as if his reasoning is fine. And so, again, that's the disconnect, is that they'll say, we don't know that anything we think is true, and we do recognize that we have biological influences that make some of the things we believe and think and do unrational. But let me tell you about this other thing, which I think is true and I think is completely rational. So it's hard to use a mechanism which we know is error-laden that can then correct the error-laden thoughts that come from that mechanism to produce, logic and rationality. And then the evolutionary explanation. So in my notes, I talk about the belief in the evolutionary explanation of reasoning. And Nagel also addresses it, and he explains why that's not a very good explanation. So imagine that you have a calculator. You probably all have a smartphone in your pocket right now, and if you take it out and you pull up the calculator, and if you press the number 3, and then you press the time signal, and then you press the number 5, okay, and then you'll press the equal sign, and then the 15 will show up in the display, right? Well, a calculator doesn't think. The calculator doesn't reason. It's been pre-programmed to display that 15 after pressing those buttons in that sequence, okay? Now imagine that you have a calculator and the reason why that answer is correct is because of the pre-programming of the designer. Now imagine that you all have your own calculators, but your calculators have evolved over time, and the purpose of the calculator was to survive and reproduce. The purpose of the calculator is to not produce truthful thoughts or blings. The main purpose is to survive and reproduce. Each one of us are going to have calculators that have different circuitry. Each one of us are going to have calculators that have different history. And each one of us, when we press in 3 times 5 equals, will very likely get a different response. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, how do we know which calculator is correct, if any calculator is correct? Again, Steve says we can't know anything we think is true. Everything we think is subjective, so all of our calculators are going to be subjective. Our calculators will likely have produced different responses. How can we ever know which one is true, which one is correct? And that's, again, one of the problems of the evolutionary explanation. Sam Harris, in his book, both in Free Will and the Moral Landscape, also acknowledges how the evolutionary explanation causes us to believe false things. And so, again, I elaborate further on that in my notes, which I would encourage you to get a copy of. So I think at this point we'll go ahead and move on to the Q&A. So this is how the Q&A is going to work. Just a reminder again that we have a large group here, probably have some different perspectives. So one of the things that we want to maintain is gentleness and respect. We have 2 rules with the Q&A. First of all, I'll let you know we're going to have 2 people with microphones that will be standing on each side. And so if you have a question, raise your hand and they will bring a microphone to you. These are the 2 rules of the Q&A. The first rule is, please ask a question. You have probably been there where some guy starts talking and then 5 minutes and then 10 minutes later and he gets to the end and we're all just rolling our eyes waiting for the question. No question. He just wanted us all to know what he thought about this particular topic. Okay? Don't be that guy. All right? That's all I'm saying. Don't be that guy. If you need to set up your question with just a little bit of commentary, then please feel free to do that. But please be quick, ask a question. We have a lot of people that probably have questions, and we want to be respectful to other people. Second, yes? Okay, second rule of the Q&A, I'm the president, I get to ask the first question. And I've never explained why that is. There's 2 reasons why that is. First of all, I'm the one that spends all the time and effort inviting these speakers in, and that's my reward for doing it. And the second is I try to model how to ask a question. A little bit of commentary and then the question. So,
I just want to put in a word for doubt. Okay? There's not enough doubt in this world. Okay? Everybody, you'll notice my presentation, and as John said, is about beliefs. It's not about knowledge. Okay? My interest is in beliefs, how we form our beliefs. Whether our beliefs are true or not, that's another discussion for another time. But there's far too much concern about certainty, okay? Everybody wants to prove that they're right, the other person is wrong, okay? I'm just putting in a word for doubt.
Okay. All right. So, first question. And also what I'm going to do is after I've asked my question, I'm going to give Steve an opportunity to ask me a question. That seems to be only fair. So, I had a question for you, and I'm trying to remember what that is now. That is the problem of getting older. Oh, yes. Okay. So I remember what the question is. So, as I mentioned before, the thing that differentiates you between a lot of other atheists is that they're strictly materialists, and they believe that nothing is immaterial. Our thoughts are material. Our consciousness is material if it exists. Everything is material. So I'd like to know what convinces you that your thoughts and consciousness are, in fact, immaterial.
Well, if I had bothered to read any other atheists, I might have realized that that's what they thought. I'll have to get back to you on that. Why do I think that my thoughts are immaterial? Why do I think that my consciousness is not physical? Seems pretty obvious to me. Do I know it to be true? I hear scientific experiments about auras and things like that. I've read a little bit about people trying to prove the existence of free will using quantum mechanics. I don't understand that. To me, quantum mechanics is about randomness and uncertainty, not about causality. So, yeah, I don't have a clear answer. If I'll give it some thought,
Okay.
I'll get back to you.
All right. If you email us the answer, I'll share it with everybody. Okay. And so you have a question for me.
Where are we going to lunch on Monday?
Is that it?
That's all I got for now.
We're taking you to some top 50 Texas barbecue. We're going to Terry Black's Barbecue, which is the only top 50 place that's open on a Monday. And we are very much looking forward to it.
Okay, sounds good.
And the question I really wanted to ask, that was actually the second question I wanted to ask. The question I really want to ask, I have to wait till Monday
Okay.
because I want to ask Lynn.
Uh-oh.
And I didn't want to do that in front of everybody here. So we'll wait for Monday. So first question is right here. And so let us know who you want to direct that question to.
So I just briefly, I recognize part of the problem in your argument is you tend towards reductionism. And the idea of conflating belief with say, an artificial intelligence scarcity of data. So whether you recognize a duck as a dog is simply a scarcity of data, pattern recognition problem. The question I had for you, and of course you just shot it down. You just shot down the question of not dealing with quantum physics or quantum mechanics. Is in Bell's theorem, he dispels the idea of randomness, where he shows that the observer does in fact have an effect over the behavior of a quantum particle. So if we go to ultimate reductionism, where observation changes quantum behavior, how is that not an effect on our ultimate physical reality?
So my understanding of the quantum mechanical principle that observation affects reality is not that the observer is not the observer's perspective. It's the fact that at the atomic level, there's a photon bouncing off an electron, and that photon is what's observed by the observer. The photon is physically affecting the path of the electron. So my understanding, is that not correct? I don't know. That's what I was taught in the 1980s in my physics class.
Okay, John, and then. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, all right, wait a minute, John. I think we're back here. Yeah, so we're on that side next. Yes, you.
Paul was brilliant. The other apostles said he was brilliant and even wrote so much that they thought he was hard to understand. You've come all the way here after self-publishing a book. He traveled far. He was knocked off his horse by a brilliant light, and he changed 180 degrees. Are you open to that happening to you, since you traveled all the way to Austin as a member of the culture that is taking over academia, medicine,
Okay.
in every other realm? And
All right.
are you open to being knocked off your horse?
Absolutely. So,
This-
of course, I'm not going to wager money on it, but it's certainly possible.
All right, where's the next question, John? Okay.
Steve, I wanted to ask, you gave us an experiment, a couple of experiments, I believe. You gave us a couple of seconds to experiment with changing our free will, I believe is the correct way to put it. It seemed like in both the experiments, the exercise was to try to change our belief during those seconds. And it seems like what's implied is in that experiment, we're required to suspend rational thought in that. And it seems like the implication is that free will means that we suspend rational faculty of our brain. To me, I would think I mean, I don't believe in that in forming new beliefs, that I should suspend rationality. Could you comment on that?
Sure. In the initial draft of my talk, I waited 60 seconds for each experiment. But I was told by my family that that's way too long. So I had to cut it down to 3 or 4 seconds. So I'm sure that in 60 seconds you could have done it. No, that's a facetious answer. Okay, never mind. Listen, I don't mean to be flip. Well, I always mean to be flip. But whether it takes a moment or 4 months, that process is going to occur. If you end up questioning your beliefs, and in that process, your belief ends up changing, it's because you've acquired new evidence, okay? You can go through that process of considering your beliefs. By the way, if you do go through that process of considering your beliefs, that also is happening automatically and involuntarily. But if in that process, your belief ends up changing, I believe it's because you've got a new set of evidence. Lack of free will doesn't mean everything is static or anything is static. Quite the opposite. It means that at every moment of time, you are who you are at that moment, and in the next moment, your history has changed. Your genetics are the same, but your history has changed, and you may have acquired additional information. Maybe in that process of thinking about your thoughts, you read some things or reconsidered what had been leading up to the beliefs that you had, and that can end up changing, for sure. But again, it's not a necessary result of that process. You can't, at the beginning of the process, guarantee that you're going to end up with a different belief. So that's maybe.
If I could make a comment.
Sure.
It seems like the process of changing your beliefs involves your rational mind, which includes acquiring new evidence. And I don't think the Christian or the non-Christian would disagree with that. We would all agree that our rational mind plays a part in our beliefs.
And I would say that our rational mind is generated automatically and involuntarily.
I would think I would just point out it's just a different philosophical perspective, right? Someone who acknowledges free will, things that at least some point in that continuum, in that process, that we could have freely chosen our belief, whereas you would say that that entire process all happened automatically, involuntarily, and subjectively.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, yes.
I've got a question for each of you, if that's okay. Joe.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sure.
I'll start with you.
Okay.
You were talking about the Big Bang and the cosmological argument.
Yes.
And it seemed that you were pointing to the Big Bang being evidence for a supernatural creator.
A supernatural event.
Supernatural event.
Okay.
Excuse me. How can you conclude that that was supernatural rather than just unknowable?
Well, at this point, it's based on our current modern science. It is the current model of the universe is the Big Bang. And so there's a difference between it being referring to a supernatural creator and a supernatural event. So the Big Bang itself just indicates that there was a cause outside of the universe itself that's responsible for it coming into existence. Now, whether that was a mechanistic cause or whether it was some sort of intelligent cause, the Big Bang cosmology itself doesn't answer that question. You have to move to different evidence to get to that question.
But wouldn't that be reducing what could potentially be a natural cause? Let's say the Big Bang came from a singularity in the past, and prior to that, there were events that trickled down almost like a funnel coming down, hit the singularity and exploded outwards, and they're all naturalistic.
Okay, so.
Why would that necessitate supernatural?
Yep, so Dr. Jeff Zweerink, who's an astrophysicist with reasons to believe, he wrote an excellent book called Escaping the Beginning. And he came here and presented this a little over a year ago, Escaping the Beginning. So we do have the DVD over there at the table. He can go into more detail. He talks about the history of Big Bang cosmology and how people have tried to move it to a natural event that can be explained within the universe. And so initially, Einstein rejected the results of the Big Bang, and the mindset of science at the time was that the universe was eternal and it was static. So he introduced what he called a fudge factor to maintain a static universe. He later would say that was the biggest blunder of his scientific career. Then eventually it came out with a steady state universe model where the universe continues to expand, but matter just sort of pops into existence, maintaining the static nature of it. That eventually appeared to be disproven. And then they came up with an oscillating model of the universe where you have this big bang that's followed by a big crunch, and then it just oscillates back and forth. And so what we see is the big bang, but eventually it'll be followed by a big crunch. Well, now we know about dark energy, and so dark energy has made it to where the oscillating universe is probably not correct, practically disproven. Now they're talking about quantum gravity as a possible model of the universe. And so there are numerous quantum models, quantum gravity models of the universe. Some of them require a beginning, some of them do not require a beginning. So a lot of people, a lot of atheists are pinning their hopes on a possible new quantum model that doesn't require a beginning. Oh, and I forgot the inflationary model of the universe also came out, and now they're saying all inflationary models require a beginning. And so one of the points that he makes is that we keep finding this evidence that points to a beginning. We keep trying to come up with other explanations that don't require a beginning, and the universe keeps pointing us back to a beginning. And so the oscillation are theories that seem to go out from a beginning, back to a beginning, out from a beginning, back to a beginning. The universe keeps moving us back to a beginning. So what are we going to learn in the future from quantum models? We don't know. If there is no beginning, if it's eternal, then that's going to argue against a supernatural event. But if it did begin, if it had an ultimate beginning of all time, matter, space, and energy, then that implies that there was a cause that existed outside of the universe, and by definition, I would say that that would be a supernatural cause, an event that happened outside of the laws of physics of this universe.
Thank you.
Speaking of all those theories of physics, did I mention something about doubt a little while ago? There's a lot of reason to doubt. Sorry.
So my question for you, Steve, is on consciousness, and you said that it was biologically determined, automatic, involuntary. Do you believe that there's a line between consciousness and unconsciousness, biological or not? So we believe humans are conscious. How about dogs? How about goldfish? How about bacteria? Or take it to the extreme of plants or rocks, etc.?
Honestly, I don't even know that you have consciousness. I only know that I have consciousness. Seriously. I have no idea about dogs. My guess is rocks don't have consciousness. Maybe dogs have some consciousness. Can you have a little bit of consciousness? I don't know. I don't know.
Thanks for coming all this way, sir. So you talking about that our biology and genes and all that affect our thoughts, but not vice versa. And it makes me wonder about, like, when you're in a highly emotional state or stressful state, you're freaking out, panicking, and yet you calm yourself, whether it's by biofeedback or just sort of take a deep breath, you idiot, slow down, calm down, you know, your thoughts are forcing your body to respond to, in opposition to the stimulus that you're seeking. How do you account for that? How is that different from free will? Because it's like you're consciously saying, no, I'm not going to respond this way.
I think it's the graph that John put together, which he put together, but I do agree with it. And it shows a sequence of thoughts generated by my brain at the bottom.
Right.
So the second thought is generated by the state of my brain when the first thought is generated. It leads to the state of my brain at time B when my second thought is generated. So it's not the fact that thought A is causing thought B. It's the fact that my brain is generating these thoughts, and my brain automatically and involuntarily generated the thought that, oh my God, I'm freaking out, I better do something else, start doing deep breaths, whatever it is. So it certainly appears, right? There is this illusion of free will. It feels like I'm in control of at least some of my actions. But again, I think that's an illusion. And it's the brain doing its brain thing all along, generating those thoughts in that sequence.
Okay, Mary?
This is for you, Mr. Murphy.
Okay.
And this is in reference to Sam Harris's wife, Annika Harris's book called Conscious that we both read.
Right.
In the presence of all of this information that I've just received, I want to ask you to respond to the experiments in her book about trypanosoma or the orb weaving spiders, like all of those examples of free will being lost, and most importantly, the brain scan experiment that shows that our decision was made before we were even aware of it.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to make this the last question because of the time, if that's okay. So, so two things there. One is the first two examples that you gave. I don't remember those specifically, but I do remember that she referred to some split brain experiments that show that people can sometimes sort of possess two different consciousness. And so that is a very interesting thing to think about. The way that I try to visualize that is that whereas most atheists are materialists, they only believe that the material exists, that nothing else exists. I'm a dualist because I believe that there is the material and the immaterial. As a dualist, I do embrace the material aspects that we study via science. And so when we have these scientific studies that demonstrate the material effects of the brain and things that happen, I can appreciate the truth that those studies are providing because I recognize the material nature of our existence. The split brain experiments are fascinating. I don't think that they entirely prove that we don't have consciousness, or that, well, they actually show we do have consciousness. They show that our consciousness can be split. What I would say is that from an immaterial perspective, our body only works as much as it's functioning properly. And so if I have a soul and I blow out my knee, which I've done twice, and I lose my my ACL ligament, okay, then it's not going to function the way it should if it was completely whole. And so that also translates to our brain, that when we're using our brain, if there are certain things that we do with our brain, or if our brain has been impacted in some way, our brain is a material organ, okay? It's an organ just like our other organs, like he says. Our ability to use that brain will be impacted, okay, by what happens to the brain. So that's the materialistic part of that.
Well, the reference that I'm specifically curious of are the brain scans that show
Okay.
our decisions were made.
Yes,
before
that's the
we-
second part of the question.
Oh, okay.
The scientific studies. So Steve did not refer to any scientific studies in his book, but Sam Harris does refer to scientific studies in his book on free will. And so in my notes, I actually spent about 10 pages addressing these scientific studies. So Sam Harris referred to 3 studies, and I'm only going to talk about one. I'm going to talk about the most embarrassing one for his position. As a matter of fact, I actually have just real quick. Well, it may take me a minute to get to it, but he concludes that these scientific studies demonstrate that scientists are able to detect the decision we're going to make before we're conscious of making that decision, right? One of those studies was a study by J.D. Haynes, and that was published in 2011. And J.D. Haynes had 2 buttons that you were supposed to push, a left button and a right button. And you were supposed to pay attention to when you made the decision to execute that. And what the researchers found is that there were 2 areas in the brain that allowed the researchers to predict up to 7 to 10 seconds before the person said that they were conscious of making the decision what they would choose. Now think about that. That is stunning, isn't it? 7 to 10 seconds before you decide what to do, they were able to detect what you could do. Well, one thing that well, first of all, this is a general comment in regard to all these scientific studies. All these scientific studies are trying to test snap decisions. And they generalize that snap decisions are the same thing as contemplative decisions. And I would say that those are 2 different operations. And philosophers would also point out that those are 2 different styles of brain operation. So you can't generalize from the way things happen with a snap decision to the way your brain activates when you're contemplating something. One of the things that Harris did not mention in his book was that they were only predict with 60% accuracy what the person was going to choose. That's a big omission. 50% is just blind guessing, right? So the results were only marginally improved over blind guessing. It's a long way from being able to say that they were able to predict everything that they decided before they decided. The other thing is the audacity to say that they could know that 7 to 10 seconds before you actually made the decision. Philosopher Alfred Mela is a professor at Florida State University. He's a philosophy professor. He gave an analogy to demonstrate just how unbelievable that interpretation of the experiment was. He said, okay, let's reconduct the experiment, the exact same experiment. People select left or right button. The researchers have the brain signals that show which button they're going to select 7 to 10 seconds before the participant selects it. Let's turn that monitor around. Let's let the participant see what they are going to select 7 to 10 seconds before they select it and see if they can change it. We all know what would happen. We can make decisions in a split second, and that shows that that experiment may be detecting something, but it's not detecting the ultimate final decision, because I guarantee you, practically everyone, if they're shown that they're going to press the left button, then they could press the right button as soon as they recognize that. So that is not a accurate interpretation of the study. Does that help? Okay. Let's thank Steve for coming. Thank you again very much.